welcome to the deep dive. You know, the place where we like really get into those complex ideas, the ideas that make you think. And we use your sources, the stuff you've curated, to make sure that you really get it fast.
It's kind of like we're that shortcut to being really, truly like deeply well-informed.
Yeah, exactly.
And for this deep dive, we're going deep, like way deep, into a question that I just know is going to like really resonate with you. As a philosopher, what's the place of like metaphysics in Chinese philosophy?
Yeah.
You shared a fascinating entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Yes.
That really grapples with this very issue.
Exactly. Now, you, as someone who loves like getting to the core of philosophical arguments, and you like to do it quickly and thoroughly, so I think you've probably already considered this. Does that term even like metaphysics? You know, it's very clear Western lineage. Does it even fit when we're talking about Chinese thought?
Right.
Is that like trying to put like Kant on a totally different intellectual landscape? It's like, does it even work? And that's exactly where our source starts. Is there metaphysics in Chinese philosophy?
Right. It's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. So what's the initial position?
Well, one of the first things that struck me when I was reading this was the acknowledgement that there isn't really a direct, like a one-to-one equivalent to the term, this Western concept of metaphysics, in like early Chinese philosophical vocabulary. So right off the bat, there's this issue of translation, of trying to find the right words to even talk about the same things.
Okay, but let's just unpack that for a second. So even without a neat label like metaphysics, the core concerns, those core questions that metaphysics is trying to get at, those were definitely present.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely. I mean, the entry clarifies that if we take a broad definition of metaphysics, so like we think about it as a philosophical inquiry that's concerned with the ultimate nature of reality.
Okay.
Which would include things like being, origins, components, change, all of those big questions. Then Chinese thinkers have definitely like engaged with this stuff. They've wrestled with these fundamental questions, maybe through different lenses, but they're there.
Okay, that makes sense. So the source is making this case, right, that we need to be more inclusive with our definition of metaphysics. It's saying like, look, this allows for a genuine exchange of ideas across cultures.
Right. Yeah, and it avoids, I think, the danger of just dismissing entire traditions because their vocabulary doesn't perfectly match up with, you know, what we in the West have come to expect.
Right. And that would be a huge loss, wouldn't it? To just overlook centuries of thinking just because they don't use the exact same terms.
Absolutely. That would be a shame.
Yeah. But this source also brings up a really crucial point, right? This danger of imposing those Western frameworks that we're so used to onto Chinese thought. Like, are we just forcing it into a box that doesn't quite fit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's that risk of distorting it, right? Trying to force it into a box that it doesn't belong in. And the entry is really careful about that. They say, you know, they're going to focus on those issues and questions that really came up organically, like within the Chinese traditions themselves.
Okay.
And then only draw connections to Western metaphysics where it makes sense.
Yeah.
Like organically.
So understand it on its own terms first.
Yeah.
I like that. Now, you mentioned the Chinese translation for metaphysics, Sick Air Shengzu. Can you break that down for us? What does it literally mean, and what's its relevance here?
Yeah, so Exing or Shengsu literally means the study of what is above forms. And the thing that I find really interesting as a philosopher is that it actually comes from the Yi Jing, or the classic of changes. And in the Yi Jing, it talks about this distinction between what is above forms, which refers to the that underlying process or way of the universe, and then what is below forms. And that refers to key, like the concrete stuff, the vital energy that makes up things.
Okay. But it's important to note that this isn't like a strict separation between transcendent and immanent realms, like you might see in the West. Right. Instead, both the Tao, which is formless, and the Qi, which has form, are understood to be immanent. They're continuously interacting within the natural order. Like it's all one interconnected thing.
That's a really interesting point. Even the translation itself hints at like a more integrated and process-oriented view. Right from the beginning. Now, before we get into that cosmogonic term, which I think is super interesting and I'm excited to talk about it, the source mentions that there were some what they call proto-metaphysical roots.
Yeah, like setting the stage.
Yeah, setting the stage. And it had something to do with the mandate of heaven, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So to really grasp the later developments, we have to look at earlier concepts, like Leidzin,
which is often translated as heaven or the sky, and then Ming, which is often translated as command or fate, and then put those two together, and you get the Tianming, the mandate of heaven, which comes from the Zhou dynasty.
Okay.
And this was the idea, the foundational idea that was used to legitimize the Zhou overthrowing the previous dynasty, the Shang dynasty.
Okay. And how was this early Tian, this heaven, how was it conceived? Was it some kind of, like, I don't know, divine authority figure?
It was initially described, I think, in pretty, like, anthropomorphic terms. Like, Tian had awareness.
Yeah.
Preferences, even values. And its primary concern was the well-being of the people.
Interesting.
There's this really powerful line that's quoted in the Mengzi, which says, "Heaven sees from where my people see. Heaven hears from where my people hear."
Wow.
So it suggests this cosmos that operates on these consistent patterns. And these patterns, they actually include ethical and political dimensions.
Yeah.
So a ruler's legitimacy, how much right they had to rule, was actually tied to their ability to govern according to heaven's will.
So, like, in line with this cosmic order.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And this was reflected in how well they took care of their people, how much the populace was flourishing.
So it was a kind of early connection between the cosmic order and political legitimacy.
Exactly. So the idea was that if a ruler governed justly, if they served the people, they would be supported by heaven. But if they were tyrannical, they would face, like, natural disasters.
Oh, no.
And ultimately be overthrown because heaven had withdrawn its mandate. And so this placed a really big emphasis on human actions and how they were actually integral to this cosmic order rather than just being subject to, like, arbitrary divine interventions.
Okay, so not just like random acts of God, but actually like human actions have a real impact. That's a fascinating idea. But even with these seemingly personal qualities, Archean wasn't completely transcendent.
Right.
Not like completely separate from the world, like you were saying.
Right. It's a key distinction. Right. You know, Archean could be willful and responsive, but it wasn't transcendent in the sense of being totally external to the natural order. Tian could refer to, like, the physical sky, the movements of the celestial bodies. Like, it could be the encompassing cosmic force that governs everything.
So it's both.
Yeah, kind of all of those things at once. And the term for world, Tianxia, literally means under heaven. So it highlights this immanence. Heaven's will was primarily expressed through events within the world, especially through human affairs and natural phenomena.
Okay. So the seeds for a more naturalistic worldview were already there, even in this early concept of Tianxian.
Exactly.
Now, the source also talks about this crisis of the mandate of heaven during the decline of the Zhou dynasty. How did that period of, all the upheaval, the civil war, how did that impact metaphysical thinking?
Well, think about it. Centuries of intense civil war and social upheaval, that makes it really hard to believe in this morally ordered cosmos overseen by a benevolent Tianxian.
Right.
I mean, if Tianxian is supposed to be good and just and looking out for us, then why all this suffering?
Yeah, like, where's Tianjin in all of this?
It raises questions that are, like, really similar to the problem of evil in Western theodicy.
That's a good point.
So the source talks about three main philosophical responses to this crisis. Okay, so first, you've got the Mohists.
Okay.
They basically doubled down on the idea of this benevolent heaven that actively rewards good people, especially those who show inclusive care for everyone. Then you've got another viewpoint. This one kind of flips the script, emphasizing vining not as a divine command, but as blind fate. So, like, suggesting that things just happen.
Without reason.
Yeah. No inherent reason, no ethical consideration. It's just fate.
Wow.
And then the third response, and this one's really important because it ends up being super influential, argued for the regularity of natural patterns. But it saw those patterns as, like, inherently amoral, like devoid of this ethical bias.
So it's like the universe just is.
Yeah, it just is.
Yeah.
And success and well-being in this view depend on understanding those patterns, aligning yourself with them, rather than necessarily adhering to ethical norms.
Interesting. So it's like a shift from a cosmos governed by this divine will to one that's understood through these impersonal but very real natural patterns.
Exactly. A huge shift, a foundational insight that shapes later Chinese thought.
Yeah, and even though the debate about the connection between those natural patterns and human values, that continues.
Oh, for sure.
But this idea that there are consistent natural patterns, like, that became central to how people thought about the universe.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like the playing field for a lot of the later developments we're going to talk about.
Totally. Okay, so now we're at the 4th century BCE, right? And this is when the cosmogonic turn happens.
Yeah.
So what made this shift so radical? What changed in philosophical thinking?
So during this time, you had this fundamental change in how people approached philosophical inquiry. The focus really shifted to questions of cosmogony. So like, how did everything come into being? How did all these diverse things in the world come to be? And how do they continue to take form?
Right. Like, where did it all begin?
Exactly. And the Laozi is the most famous text from this era.
Mm-hmm.
But archaeologists have found a lot of other texts from this period, and it shows that this was like a big intellectual movement, this exploration of origins.
Wow. So it wasn't just one person. It was like a whole bunch of people starting to think about these things.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And this focus on origins, it seems to have coincided with this like really significant decentering of humanity.
Okay, decentering. What do you mean by that?
Well, in the Zhuangzi, there's this really vivid image. It says that from the perspective of the day, humans are just one of the 10,000 things, no more or less significant than like a single hair on a horse's body.
So not so special, after all.
Not so special. Just one part of this vast interconnected web.
Yeah.
And this break from anthropocentrism, it kind of went hand in hand with a shift away from purely humanistic values.
Okay, so less focus on things like, I don't know, ritual propriety or righteousness.
Right. And more of a concern with things like preserving life, minimizing desires, and acting in accordance with the natural flow of things, spontaneously.
Interesting. So a more holistic, less human-centered view of the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
And what were the core assumptions, like the things that all these cosmogonies kind of agreed on?
Yeah, there are 4 of them. 4 really fundamental assumptions that the source outlines. First is that all the diverse phenomena in the world, they all ultimately come from this one unified source.
Okay.
Second, the generation of these things, of all these things, happens spontaneously, without any external designer, purpose, or will.
Okay.
Third, this ultimate source isn't transcendent or separate, but it's immanent, meaning it's within the world, and you can access it or understand it in some way.
Okay.
And the fourth one is that there are these intermediary stages or processes through which that ultimate source gives rise to the concrete things that we actually experience, especially those like dynamic interplays of polarities.
Like yin and yang.
Exactly. And cyclical patterns of change.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. Let's try and go through these one by one, starting with this idea of monism. So the idea that there's this one single ultimate origin for everything. What are the key terms they use for this, and what are the philosophical implications?
Okay, so the most well-known term is probably Tao.
Right.
Often translated as like way, path, or the fundamental principle of the universe. Another really crucial term is Taiji, which is the supreme polarity.
Okay.
And it comes from the Yi Jing, and it's the primordial unity from which yin and yang emerge.
Okay.
So this idea of this like singular underlying origin had a big impact on Chinese metaphysics because it implies this fundamental interconnectedness, like a unity beneath all the apparent diversity. And that leads to a really big question. What accounts for all the distinct things, all the individual things, if there's really just this underlying unity?
Yeah, how do you get from one to many?
Exactly. That's the problem of distinction. It's a big deal in Chinese philosophy. And the source points out that it's actually a really interesting contrast with the European philosophical tradition, where we're often more concerned with what they call problems of reconciliation.
Okay, what's the difference?
Well, in the West, it's often like we have all these separate pieces, these puzzle pieces, and we're trying to figure out how to fit them together. But in Chinese thought, it's more like we start with a single block of clay.
Okay.
And we're trying to understand how all these different shapes, all these forms emerge from it.
That's a really great analogy. I like that. So Western thought kind of begins with separate entities and then tries to bring them together. And Chinese thought often starts with unity and tries to figure out how things become separate.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And even when they talk about this ultimate origin as the one, there's still some ambiguity there. This source points that out.
Okay, like what? What's ambiguous about it?
Well, the Laozi says the one generates two, two generates three, and then the myriad things.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's this singular origin, right? But then other passages suggest that even the one isn't really the ultimate, that it arises from the Tao.
Right.
And then it gets even more complicated when the Laozi says that all things are born from being, from you, but you itself is generated from no being, from Wu.
Okay. No, that is confusing.
Right. So this sparks this big debate. Is this ultimate origin a thing in itself? Or is it something even more fundamental,
okay,
even more basic than any particular entity? And while some thinkers propose a more substantial one, the dominant view, especially in the Zhuangzi, leans toward this idea that what makes things things is not itself a thing, or in Chinese, it's wu wu xie fi wu.
Wow. That's pretty mind-bending.
It is.
And it's hard to wrap your head around it. Can we talk a little bit more about yu and wu in this context? Because those are pretty central terms, right?
Oh, yeah, they're super central.
Yeah.
They get translated a lot as being and non-being. But the entry emphasizes that wu doesn't mean like complete nothingness, like a void. It's not an empty box.
Okay.
It's more like a lack of determinate, differentiated beings. So like undifferentiated potentiality, a state before things take on definite forms.
So maybe more like presence and non-presence.
Yeah, I like that. Or determinate and indeterminate, or even being there and not being there. Those translations might actually be better at capturing the nuance.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense. So it's not empty, it's just not formed yet.
Yeah, exactly. Like think of it like uncarved wood. It's full of potential, but no specific form.
Yeah.
Then you is like the carved statue. It's definite and it's present.
Okay.
And this dynamic interplay between those two, between the primordial undifferentiated state and then the world of all these different beings, this is a huge metaphysical theme throughout Chinese philosophy. You see it popping up again and again, even later in Buddhist discussions of emptiness.
Right, that makes sense. Okay, so now we've got this idea of a single, maybe even non-thing origin. And the question is, how do all these different things come about? How do we get from this unity to the diversity that we see in the world? And that brings us to the second shared assumption, spontaneous generation, or Ziran.
Ziran is huge. Like this is one of those key concepts you really need to get. It literally means self-so, or to be so of oneself.
Okay.
And that basically rules out any idea that there's some external purpose, some conscious design or deliberate intention in how the universe was created or how it unfolds.
Okay.
And the emergence of this idea of Ziran as this primary explanation for the origin and nature of things, it kind of coincided with the decline of the more like personal. Yeah.
So Sirmaning is this like divine will, it kind of fades into the background.
Yeah, exactly. And at first glance, explaining things through Ziran, it might sound like you're just saying that's just how it is.
Right, like that's not much of an explanation.
But the entry makes this really interesting connection to the Western concept of kausasui.
Which means?
Self-caused. So it's the idea that something can be its own cause.
Okay.
But in Chinese thought, instead of locating that self-causality in, say, a transcendent God or something outside the universe, they see it as like inherent in existence itself. And you can see parallels, I think, with Spinoza's idea of conatus, which is the inherent striving of each thing to exist.
Okay.
And maybe even Nietzsche's idea of the will to power as this fundamental driving force.
So this idea of like dynamism.
Yeah.
And a self-organizing principle within existence itself.
Exactly. It's not static.
Right.
And that leads us to the third point.
Okay.
Existence isn't just like static being. It's more like Xing.
Okay, what is Xing?
Life, growth, birth, vitality. It's this continuous process of becoming. The commentary on the I Ching even describes the foundation of change as Xing, unceasing generation. It's kind of like the Western concept of naturing.
Okay.
So the idea here is that instead of needing some external source for motion and order and life, they're seen as inherent, like built into being itself.
And so this spontaneity, this vitality, it applies to both the ultimate source and the individual things in the world. It's not just like this top-down thing.
Yeah, exactly. Ziran is attributed to both the Tao as the ultimate ground and the myriad things that come from it. In the Laozi, there's that famous line that says the Tao follows Ziran. So even the ultimate principle operates according to this inherent spontaneity. But then other passages talk about the Ziran of individual things, their inherent tendencies and unfolding. And that's a big contrast to the Western idea of a transcendent God who created the world ex nihilo, like out of nothing, and remained separate from it. But Chinese philosophy, with its emphasis on being as this continuous process of Shang, it doesn't create that same kind of separation.
Okay, so no big ontological divide between the creator and the created. Now this Tao that follows Ziran, is this something that you can actually understand? How do you access that?
So because Tao's spontaneity is always present and immanent, accessing it isn't about reaching some distant realm, like a heaven.
Right.
It's more about removing the obstacles that stop us from aligning with it.
Okay, like what?
Like our striving, our attachments to, like goals and desires, our artificial constructs. Those are the things that are in the way. Ziran is what remains when we let go of those forced actions. And we allow things to unfold naturally. And this is captured by this concept of wu wei, often translated as no action.
Okay.
But it really means like non-coercive action, effortless action, action that's in harmony with the natural flow. The Zhuangzi also talks about fasting of the heart mind, or sinsai, which is about emptying yourself, like getting rid of preconceptions and judgments. And it lets you become more receptive to the spontaneous workings of qi, of that vital energy.
So being present, being in the moment.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the last shared assumption of these cosmogonies was that there are these intermediary stages, especially the interplay of polarities and cyclical patterns. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So if the ultimate ground, the Tao, is immanent and operates through Ziran, then all the diversity of the world must come about through this gradual process of spontaneous differentiation.
Okay.
And these intermediary stages, they help explain how you can have both individual things with all their different characteristics and this dynamic interconnectedness of nature as a whole system.
Okay.
And the most fundamental stage involves the interaction of polar forces. Of course, yin and yang are the big ones here.
Right.
Which originally they just referred to the shady and sunny side of a mountain.
Right, right.
But then they came to encompass all these contrasting but also complementary qualities. Female and male, dark and light, passive and active.
Right.
And this dynamic interaction between them was seen as like the engine of creativity and change.
Like the interplay of opposites.
Exactly. Like how you get new life through the interplay of the masculine and the feminine.
Okay, so beyond these polarities, there's also this emphasis on cycles as a way to explain things.
Right. Oh, yeah. Huge emphasis on cycles. Things like the 4 seasons, the phases of the moon, that waxing and waning.
Right.
All these patterns were seen as super fundamental to understanding natural processes. Their sustainability, their predictability, the rhythms of nature.
Okay.
And these cycles could be explained through the interplay of yin and yang, the cyclical progressions of the 5 phases, or the waxing, wood, fire, earth, metal, water. Or even the broader idea that things tend to reverse at their extremes and then return to the source.
So the universe is in this constant state of flux, this interconnectedness, and everything's transforming in these cycles.
Exactly. And it's all spontaneous, arising from a unified, immanent source.
That's amazing. Now, the source goes on to talk about the relationship between this unity, this idea of everything being interconnected, and then the differentiated world, the world where we see all these distinct things.
Yeah, that's where that problem of distinction that we talked about comes into play.
Okay, so what do they say about it?
So Chinese metaphysics, it's often monistic, right? This emphasis on oneness. But it doesn't deny that we experience a world of differences. What it does is it questions how real those differences are, like what makes something a distinct thing and how are those boundaries even defined.
Okay.
And a lot of times those boundaries, they're seen as provisional, contextual, like not as fundamental as the underlying unity. There's this amazing idea that all things fundamentally form one body, or 80. And it opens up the possibility of this radical impartiality. It's expressed so well in Guixi's saying, care overflowingly for all the myriad things. Heaven and earth form one body.
Wow, that's a really beautiful quote.
It is. And you can kind of see it as this radical extension of the early Zhu concept of action as care for the people. But now it's broadened to include everything that exists.
Okay, so no more hierarchy, just this all-encompassing care. And this idea, this emphasis on unity and impartiality, it must have had some impact on how people thought about ethics and politics.
Oh, definitely. I mean, the source mentions this great story from the Luxi Chengqi about the different perspectives of Kangzi and Lao Dan.
Okay, and how does that illustrate this tension between unity and differentiation?
So in this story, Kangzi is advocating for a differentiated care. Like, you prioritize those who are closer to you, your family, your community. But Lao Jan, who's associated with Taoism, he argues for transcending even the concept of individual persons to achieve, like, the ultimate impartiality, a state where there's no such thing as loss because there are no separate entities to lose.
Wow. So in this view, even grief is like a product of this false perception of separateness.
Yeah. And this is where you start to see some tension with Confucianism, because Confucianism traditionally emphasizes hierarchy, the 5 relationships, the different responsibilities that come with those roles.
Right. So how did Confucianism respond to this? How did they deal with this seeming contradiction between their emphasis on social roles and this more Taoist emphasis on unity?
Their main response was to explore this concept of Xing.
Okay. And what does Xing mean?
It often gets translated as nature, like human nature.
Okay.
But it refers more specifically to a thing's inherent tendencies, like how it spontaneously responds to its environment. So for humans, Pingxi manifests as desires, emotions, innate capacities. Those are called Qing, the genuine effects.
Okay.
And Confucian thinkers really debated this, like, to what extent were ethical concerns built into those natural human effects?
That's fascinating.
And so Pingxi becomes this, like, metaphysical foundation for their theories about motivation and moral psychology.
Okay.
They link human actions and ethical development to the dynamism of the natural world. It's like this bridge between the vitality of Sheng and the specific life processes and behaviors of different kinds of beings.
So this idea that ethics, human ethics, aren't just some arbitrary rules, but are actually rooted in the natural world.
Exactly. And there's this text called Xingziming Chu, which says that Pixing nature originates from Chongzming, like what is allotted or decreed, and that comes from Kordishan, from heaven. So it's all connected. Human motivation and ethical potential are grounded in the dynamism of the natural world.
That's a really profound idea.
It is.
And Lexing also plays a big part in how they explain the organization of the world into individuals in different kinds or species of beings.
Right. You have Mengzi's debates with Gaozi about human nature. And then later in the Zhuangzi and in Guo Sheng's work, they start to talk about a more individualized Stexing, like one that's unique to each person.
Okay, so that's interesting. Now, the source then brings up correlative cosmology, which comes about during the late Warring States and the Han Dynasty.
Yeah, that's a big shift in thinking.
What were the central ideas of correlative cosmology? How was it different?
It's really focused on systematic categorization.
Okay.
The Chinese word is lei, and it's also about this theory of causality that's based on stimulus and response, or resonance, called ganning. So instead of this like overarching cosmological principle like the Daiho, they're more focused on these interconnected patterns and correspondences. And there's this great quote from the Lushi Chonki. It says, "Things of the same kind summoning each other."
Interesting.
So that really captures this idea of resonance and interconnectedness based on like shared categories.
So things aren't just linked by a shared origin, but also by belonging to similar categories.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does this categorization work? What are some of the systems they use?
Well, you've got yin and yang. You've got the 5 phases, or wuxing. And then you've got those trigrams and hexagrams from the Yi Jing.
Right.
And they start to integrate all of these.
Wow.
To create this really comprehensive framework for understanding the universe and the relationships between all these different things. But those categories, they weren't based on fixed essences.
Okay.
It was more about their patterns of action, transformation, interaction. And a thing could actually be classified differently depending on the context, on the specific relationships involved.
So it's more about how things behave than what they're made of.
Exactly.
Okay, and this idea of categorization,